ccTLD. Okay. And some of the people also wonder, because some of the ccTLD perform look like a gTLD, and how to distinguish between the gTLD and ccTLD. On October the 2009, 21 gTLD and 250 ccTLD. 2012, there is open, the new gTLD program began. By 2016, now we have more than 1,000 gTLD, and I think it's more than 250 some ccTLD. If you count the IDN, there would be even more. Now the first question is, since this day, the social media search engine app is so popular, why we still need a domain name? I think there's the first question will be asked. The second question is also asked, I think three of you know that, it's a taquet. And the people don't understand if the taquet is ccTLD or gTLD, or just an animal name, cat. The third question is, why the 2 character for ccTLD only, and the commercial cannot apply for the 2 character code of the gTLD? And what about the 1 character? And is it possible in the any TLD can be blocked by in some reason? Some of the people worry about, there are question about if someone or some institution take off the ccTLD from the loop zone, is that will be, make the internet instabilities. And well, this question is almost the same as why ccTLD, why just not only 1 TLD instead of ccTLD and genetic TLDs? And maybe someone you can explain the RFC 882 and 883 in the 1983. So in the first run, I like to invite Bruce Tonkin first, and then I think I roll a sequence, Eamon and then Kenny. So Bruce, can you say first?
Sure, Kawai. So just answering the questions, I think question A relating to social media and search engines. With a search engine or a social media site, you can't really control where you might appear in the results. Whereas with a domain name, you can directly point somebody to either your email server or your web server. So it's the only really reliable way of if you're trying to provide somebody with the location of your internet resource, that you can reliably ensure that they'll actually reach your site and not somebody else's site. .cat is a 3-letter code. It's actually short for Catalan, and Catalan is a language in Spain, and there's a lot of people who have migrated from Spain to other parts of the world, and those people speak the Catalan language. And so the concept of .cat was to provide a global namespace for people wherever they are in the world that speak the Catalan language. The third one, 2 characters for ccTLDs. Well, the naming system for country codes came from the postal system, and in the postal system they needed codes to uniquely identify a country. So if you had just 1 character and you're using the Latin characters A to Z, that would only allow for 26 countries. By using 2 characters, you can allow for more than 600 countries. And so those letters, 2 characters, are reserved for countries. And when a new country is created, then a new 2 character code is created. In terms of blocking TLDs, definitely internet service providers that operate DNS services for their users can decide to block an individual domain name or a group of domain names, whether it's a gTLD or ccTLD. And in some cases, governments might direct their internet service providers to block some name. So in Australia, for example, our government sometimes directs the internet providers to block specific websites that might be involved in criminal activity of some sort. Can CCs be replaced by gTLDs? I think it's really a matter of choice. A CC is intended to be exclusive for a particular country, and that country can set its own rules. Larger countries will often set the rules up so that the country code is dedicated to their citizens or their organisations in that country. Other country codes, particularly where the country is quite small, like on a Pacific island, will often make their namespace more broadly available. But ultimately, it just comes down to a choice. You can choose between a country code or a generic top-level name. And don't really have much comment on the internet standards. They've certainly been around for a long time, and I guess stood the test of time, because by 83, you're really looking at something that's nearly 40 years ago. So those standards are still in place today.
Okay. Eamon, you have anything to comment or your view on those 6 questions?
Certainly. Thank you, Koi, for inviting me here, and happy to share my thoughts on the questions. I guess building on, actually agree very much with what Bruce said, but building on it on each of them. I guess social media and search engines themselves still need domain names, right? I mean, even getting to the social media, Facebook, or getting to Google, you would need some domain names. The question is whether you need a lot of domains and everyone need domain names. I think, as Bruce mentioned, the ability to manage the customer experience online is very important, and that relates to both the branding side and also network management, because your own, as a company providing services, the network management part, even for apps, behind the apps, it's all connected through domain names, because your infrastructure might change and the IP addresses that domain names map to could change. You could change provider, and therefore domain names will always be relevant. Whether it is the primary navigation tool is, I guess, the question, and that's that's anybody's argument. But I think in order to control the consumer experience, it's actually domain names are important. And speaking about search engines, in fact, there is lots of evidence that domain names actually help search engine optimization. So companies with domain names that is relevant to their products can rise up in the search engine rankings as well. What is .cat? As Bruce said, that's probably the official answer. But I guess the reality is that Catalan people can use .cat for showcasing the cats as well. And therein lies, I think, an exciting thing about domain names and some of the questions later as well. You look at a country code top-level domain .tv. Most people think of it as the TV, but in fact, it's actually the country Tuvalu.
Yeah.
And so I think yes, the approach for .cat is for Catalan, but once it becomes open to the internet, how people use it and interpret it is completely up to persons. The 2-character and 1-character question, that's actually very interesting. This is one of the first things that I explain to people about. And whenever we talk about domain names, country code top-level domains is each country and territory has a country code. It's almost like your postal code, and that's why it's 2 characters and it's limited to 2 characters. Anything else is actually called a gTLD. The interesting thing is that .gov, government, guess it's not really so generic. It's just the US government, but that's still called a gTLD in some sense. So About one character, this is something that I have actually come across, and I realize that from at least from the designers of the domain system, and currently I think the technology people still believes that one character TLD is, especially English character, is problematic because of potential typos. So if you mistype one character, you might go to a different domain, and that creates security concerns and so on. But that being said, I've always been supportive of having one character Chinese domain names, for example, because in terms of IDN or Chinese domain names, I think one character makes sense because it's a word. Usually a lot like cat is a word, though it's or Asia for .Asia, Asia is a word. So not allowing one character in Chinese is actually not a good thing. And I actually going forward in the new gTLD program, that's hopefully that will become a reality. So I'll quickly wrap up. I don't think that gTLDs and CCTLDs or gTLDs can replace each other. I think the name is important. It's an identity online. So a .hk versus a .tw versus a .asia are simply used for different identities. So I think once name is a very strange thing. Yes, you can probably use .com for everything that you want to do, but there's this very important but very not necessarily just a function issue, but the identity part. And I think that's why there are all these discussions that go on for 20 plus years at ICANN, because it touches people's more inner feelings about identity and why they care about certain names. So I'll stop here.
Okay. So Eamon, you still pushing for one Chinese character?
Yes, I am. And the sub-pro,
Okay.
the new gTLD, the latest policy actually suggests to allow it.
Okay. Next one is Kenny. Kenny, it's your turn. Can you make some comment? Maybe it's a good time for you to explain the IFC for us.
Okay, right. Thank you, Chair. And also thank you, Bruce and Eamon. That's very clear explanation about all this question. Actually, I have almost no further comment because they're really very explained very in detail. But just add some more few things. For example, like the first question, when you reverse the question, I take another example. It seems like people asking, we already have Facebook Messenger, how we still need an email? It's almost relevant to the first question because we need to consider whether we only allow commercial service exists in the internet application, or do we have some marginal requirement for a public service that regulated by public policy and audited by multi-stakeholder community to develop the policy. I think that's a very relevant question. Do we need to regulate application and services? That's almost very similar question. So back to IDN issue, as Eamon mentioned, when we working on IDN stuff 20 years ago, when we first proposed IDN in IETF, actually there was a lot of challenge in IETF because the senior IETF guy considered IDN is not required from engineering perspective because they consider domain name is just an identifier. An identifier not just for human being, the identifier just for machine. So if you require anything readable by human, you should leave it to application layer. That means like a World Wide Web consortium or some application developer, they will develop more proper application for human readable identification system. So actually that was starting the struggle between domain name and directory service. So after some times, even IETF have a very serious discussion. Do we need to convert domain name system into directory service system? That means every company, every individual should be able to using their real name instead of some strange identification string. So actually, that kind of discussion, really serious discuss within the IETF. We even form a working group. I forget the name, probably SI, search for name for internet resource, something like that. And we try to classify internet search service into 3 categories. The first category is DNS mapping. That's mean from name to number. The second category will be a little bit smart, and that belong to public search. When you hit certain string, for example, like a Singapore, then all the search we redirect to the Singapore authority, and they translate the string into domain name, then rolling into IANA DNS recursive process. So let's belong to second tier. The third tier will be a commercial search, like a Google, like any other search engine. So basically, there's still a lot of debate whether internet need to have a little bit intelligent to provide some directory service for the cyberspace. I think it's still under discussion even right now. So going back to some other question, for example, like why 2 character? Actually, Bruce and Emma already explained that very clear, and so I don't need to add anything at all. But just add some story about how we allocate ccTLD to the country code registry operator. In the first, do you know when will be the first ccTLD in the internet? The first ccTLD is .us. That was allocated in 1985 by John Postel. Then afterward will be .uk, the second one. Then the third one will be Israel. All was created in IANA zone file in 1985. And without any international law, without any jurisdictional consideration. And what you need is just a person, as John Postel mentioned, should be a responsible person. But usually the responsible means the first person looking for the job. So when you write a mail to John Postel say, I want to run the national ccTLD, I need this job, can you allocate to me? I study in the trial. Then you get a ccTLD. That's how internet worked in 20, 30 years ago. So let's just add some story. How come we use 2 characters instead of 3 characters? Actually, it was not any legal concern, any legal issue. It's just purely decision by a single person. So finally, just mention about RFC, for example, like a DNS related RFC as you list here, AA2 and also AA3. Basically, these 2 RFCs 2.0 and almost cannot apply for DNS because it's 2.0. And the most considerable will be 1034, 1035 RFC. That was the main structure for the DNS. I still have a lot of revision for these 2 RFC. The most useful for regarding to domain name governance will be 1591 that address the domain name structure and delegation process. And in that RFC specific mention how we manage ccTLD, how we manage the gTLD, but even though still unclear how the governance structure, how the policy was created. So that's a very early stage for the internet governance. Okay, I think I finished the first part.
Thank you very much to answer the purpose and the history section. So let's move to the next session. The next session actually we try to do is about 25 minutes talking about the domain name space and the new gTLD program. Although the new gTLD program is finishes almost 2016, and when Bruce and I just the last year of the ICANN board. So here is a domain name serve for identify the internet resources, but also there's a domain name confusion. The question is here is why the ccTLD can perform just like a gTLD. I think all 3 of you know that. For example, I think it's Eamon talking about, or Eamon or Kenny talking about the TV, or the TK, or for example, the CEO try to perform like the company, .com. If someone want to apply for Darjeeling, tea, Burgundy, or wine, actually Bruce can answer for the wine, for the TOD and second level, any restriction and why. And what is the function of the GAC in ICANN regarding for the new gTLD? Before the new gTLD program, and also now and eventually for the next round of the new gTLD, what is the government GSC function is? As we know, applying the new GTLD is very costly. The 2016, there is a cost for the 180,000 US dollar to apply a new gTLD, and not talking about marketing or all kind of travel expense. That is very difficult for SME. So how the SME, the small medium enterprise, can protect their trademark? Any suggestion? Who should apply for the new GTLD if someone using others' name or trademark to apply new gTLD or the second label? How can I protect my own interest and trademark? Of course, in the next session, we are talking about regulation, but I think in the very beginning, we might be talking about UDRP or whatever. So this turn, I will go to Eamon first, and then Kenny, and then Bruce. Eamon, please.
Certainly. Very interesting question, I guess, following from what I just mentioned about .tv, why CCTLDs can do this. In reality, as Kenny mentioned, the CCTLDs are signed very early on, was quite informal. And many of the CCTLDs today are still not directly related with the government, although there is some structure around it at this time with the ICANN process and governments reasserting some of the influence. However, the countries can decide that their name, like .co or .tv, can be used for anyone, by anyone, for any purpose that people see it as they see fit. So I guess that's really part of the openness of the internet. The restrictions on .wine, I guess I'll leave to Bruce, but I think if you're interested in certain products or certain general names like .t or those type of issues, it's quite wide open. But if the name is actually a geographic indicator, there are some further considerations, because governments might feel that it's a particular name that is representative of a particular place that is within their jurisdiction. Just to, take .asia, for example. In fact, .asia was one of the along with .cat. In fact, we were representing some geographic or linguistic community. .asia actually went through what is now called the GAC early advice process, where when .asia was applied, the GAC, the Government Advisory Committee, actually looked at it and say, hey, we might want to take a deeper look into this before we allow it through, because it's kind of like CCTLDs, but it's a bigger region. Are there policies that need to be in place? So are there any restrictions, so to speak? There are generally restrictions for these type of issues, but if you want to go for, I think if companies or communities want to apply for this type of TLD, I would always recommend to go for it. And so that relates to the GAC function, I guess. I think the governments are an important player for in the global internet ecosystem. The reality is that the internet is the mainstream core infrastructure for communications today, and for governments, as much as we want government to be as open as possible, I think they need to be involved for public interest locally. So I think that GAC's function is bringing those views into ICANN. I think currently ICANN, the structure in my mind is quite reasonable, not with the government's driving the agenda for ICANN, but actually advising ICANN on certain issues. And that's what the A part of the GAC means, right? Advisory committee.
Yep.
So that's sort of, and I think, going into future, that remains a good approach. I know it's been not really controversial, but there is some discussion about whether the GAC should have a voting membership on the board. I'm more for the part that GAC should have voting membership on the board, but that's a different discussion. But there are different views on it. So going in the future, I think the governments must continue to be involved. How is involved is that the community should evolve that over time. Then the last two questions, sorry for taking so much time, but the last two questions,
we have time.
I think for small, medium-sized businesses, I think getting your own generic top-level domain is not I wouldn't definitely recommend it unless you want to run a TLD and offer registration services. Just getting your brand name, I don't think it's that important. But I think looking at new gTLDs and thinking through what your domain strategy is important, because you might have services on different in different categories that you want to apply for those gTLDs as well. Because to me, domain names are like in the real world, we have chain stores. The reason why we have chain stores is that there are many 7-Elevens or many McDonald's because people can, easily get into those shops. On the internet, it's actually the same. Having multiple domain names increases your SEO and your presence on the internet and allows people to, find you more easily in different through different portals. So I think that's how you would think about it. But in terms of protection, the other side I actually want to bring up that I think is more interesting is our communities. I do think communities should apply for new gTLDs, even if they are expensive, because depending on objection processes, trademarks, you can object geographic names, and communities, you can try to object a commercial entity trying to take the TLD as well, but it's not as effective. If you look at .kids, for example, by the way, we're finally getting the registry agreement in place for .kids after a decade of work on that. But if you don't apply, it's very difficult to win the objection, because you have to make sure, you have to establish that the commercial entity running .kids would actually abuse .kids and create a problem for kids around the world. But that's not, it's very difficult to establish that, right? I mean, the harm is very difficult to establish. So rather than that, going proactive in applying it, then the children's rights and children's welfare community can operate .kids and put in place policies that is pertinent to .kids. That's the important, just like, you know, the work that we do for .spa as well. And, you know, many of the communities, I think, increasingly into the future, I would advise them to try to apply for the name of the community as the TLD, as that kind of protection. But for general small, medium-sized companies, even for trademarks or larger companies, I think unless you have a community directly to serve and provide registrations, yeah, you know, vanity TLDs for brands are cool, maybe, you know, good for marketing. But I think in general, that shouldn't be what the new gTLD program is for. That's my views.
Okay. The next one is Kenny.
Okay, thank
Kenny,
you, Chair.
it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Basically, the format of the question could mislead some audience because the description of the question could be it's not very correct, reflect to the current situation. For example, when we consider top-level domain, do we consider top-level domain is a property, or do we consider top-level domain would be a leasing agreement? Or do we consider top-level domain is a right to use? Or even worse, do we consider top-level domain would be a sovereignty? So different people probably have a different perception to the top-level domain. So it depends on who you are and what you want this for. And second, when we talk about gTLD, we also need to consider if there's no generic gTLD. Okay, of course, there will be a generic gTLD. But there are several categories, several purposes for the gTLD. For example, the most common one would be a general purpose of gTLD that could be open for registration. And that could be some gTLD just serve for specific community. For example, like a Cat serve for Catalonia community. And that could be gTLD that serve for geographical area. For example, like a Taipei. And that could be gTLD that serve for example, like trademark protection, or even some extreme case, some gTLD, they probably just apply the gTLD, just try to prohibit the gTLD from being used by the other peoples. So there are different purposes for the applicant and the application. So we cannot take everything as one scenario to compare with the different situation. Or finally, when you consider people probably their legal right will be abused because the new applicants, I mean, the new gTLD could be infringe their legal right. And I believe I can try the best effort to develop a lot of dispute resolution mechanism. For example, like the first new gTLD, as you mentioned, launched in 2012, 2013, anyway. And they define the objection ground for objection. If you have objection, you can follow the objection ground procedure to file your complaint to appropriate dispute resolution service provider. For example, there could be string confusion. So string confusion is the dispute resolution provider is a center for international dispute resolution. And also there could be legal right protection. And the dispute resolution provider is a WIPO. And there could be limited public interest. The dispute resolution provider is ICC, International Chamber of Commerce. And there could be dispute resolution objected by the community. Then the dispute resolution provider would be still the same, International Chamber of Commerce. They will handling the dispute if you have any complaint. They probably not far enough. So during the next round of new gTLD or ICANN subsequent procedure for new gTLD, there could be another new mechanism as well, because there always has some empty space. We need to develop a policy to correctly respond the stakeholder requirement. So at least I believe ICANN and the multi-stakeholder community try the best effort to develop policy, reflect to that kind of requirement. That's okay. That's where I end my talk.
Okay. Bruce, your turn to remember what's going on about the guidebook.
Yes, it's been a while.
And you might be, Bruce, you also can mention about what's going on about the wine and also that Amazon.
Yeah. So on the first one, I think it's interesting, the different perspectives, and I've been talking to a couple of operators, one of .cc, which is Cocos Islands, and one of .tv, which is Tuvalu. But yeah, these are very small communities, and really they see the TLD as essentially a revenue source that they then invest back in the community in basic things like better roads and infrastructure and things. So they realise that they can't generate revenue just from the local population of .tv. They're getting revenue from the global population. So I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just a different use of the namespace and a different way of supporting the local communities. The second topic, which is wine and these other names and what restrictions apply, I think one of the challenges is there's not that many restrictions. So once you have one of these namespaces, quite often the operators start with a concept that maybe only a limited number of people, may be something like Burgundy, and it should only be people in the region of France that's Burgundy. But nearly inevitably, when these TLDs start off with a narrow set of restrictions, they start to loosen them up because they find that they get more registrations, the lighter the registration rules. And the main thing that the TLDs have to manage is DNS abuse. And so the more relaxed you have in terms of getting more registrants, the benefit is you have more users. But the downside is that you make it easy for people to also use the names for criminal purposes. And if you're not careful, you'll devalue the namespace such that nobody wants to register in that namespace. So it's a balance, and good operators will always have mechanisms to reduce abuse so that the names are being used for legitimate purposes. The GAC function is an interesting one in that ICANN operates as a multi-stakeholder organisation, which includes governments, it includes people from the IT industry, it includes business users, and it includes civil society such as universities, not-for-profit organisations, and individuals that are users of the internet. I think that the challenge for government participation in ICANN is that governments are used to participating in their own right, and you may get conflicts. And the classic example that Kuo Wei mentioned was something like Amazon. So there's a name of a river, Amazon River in South America, and the countries where that river passes through feel that their views on .amazon are the most important, whereas other countries might just view Amazon as a generic a term that relates to civilization back in the days of the Greek Empire, and others see it as the name of a large IT company. So the concept of GAC was that the idea is that the governments would form a consensus view and provide consensus advice to ICANN, and it's not just individual governments. So in that way, I think it's performing a good function because it encourages the governments to reach a collective view, and often that view is fairly generic. The challenge for ICANN has always been what we used to, as Kuo Wei, remember when we were on the ICANN board, we used to say, what does that GAC speak actually mean? Because it would be in such diplomatic terms, we were sort of saying, yeah, but what do you actually want us to do? So that's the challenge. But on the other hand, the benefit is it's genuinely governments getting together and forming a common view. When we're talking about applying for gTLDs and we're talking about small businesses, the cost to apply for a gTLD is US $185,000, so it is expensive. And in terms of small businesses protecting their names, given there's now thousands of names, it's probably a little bit about in the old days when you used to pay for advertising in the yellow pages. A small business would decide what categories that they wanted to advertise in. So if they were a furniture business, they would put their advertisement in the furniture section, but they wouldn't bother putting it in the car section. And I think that's much the way generic top-level names which relate to English words like tea or burgundy or wine, a little bit like sections of the yellow pages. So if you're in the business of wine, then you may well want to register in .wine. But if you don't sell wine, you don't really need to be there. Who should apply for new gTLDs? It's an interesting question now that we've got the last round for TLDs was 2012, which is nearly 10 years ago. And the three main categories of TLDs were city or geographic names, so names like .London and .Sydney. We had brand names, so like .HSBC or as a brand, or they were generic names, so essentially categories that you might see in the yellow pages. And I think of all of those, the brand owners, what I think we underestimated back in 2012 was just how much brand value there is, particularly with search engine optimization, in brands continuing their current .com or their current country code name. And so while a number of the top brands have registered their own name at the top level, they're mostly just redirects to their existing sites. So, and in a way, they performed a similar function to short URLs used to 10 years ago, that people had found, well, the domain names were getting a bit long, and particularly in things like Twitter, where you only had 140 characters, people started registering quite short URLs that were basically redirects to the main website. And in a way, that's what brand names are doing. They're names that they might use on an advertising billboard or might use in a Twitter message, but the actual underlying website is still the same one they had 10 years ago, and it might be in .com or it might be in .uk or .tw for Taiwan. The generic names have probably been the most successful in that, much like Yellow Pages categories, people are finding that they can find a good name in the category that they want to be in, and that seems to be successful. So that's all my comments, Kuai.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go to the next section. This is a more interesting one. It's domain name abuse and also the regulations. We have some kind of funny setup, but just 24 minutes for us. Okay. We know that domain name confusing malware, botnet, or phishing, or farming, and also the spam. The question is here is applying the new gTLD is costly, and then actually we already almost answered in the last sessions. And the B is about the same thing. So the C is it possible any TLD or domain name can be blocked and some reason and what to argue? And this one actually in the very first session we're already talking about it. I think particularly interesting is European commissioning the GDPR apply in the domain name space. And what is the position of the GEC and what is the position of the CCNSO? If the government asking for the data from ICANN registry or registrar, is it possible? And because such an engine, this question is interesting. He said, could such engine ranking the ccTLD or gTLD? You know, I don't know. I just write down what the people asking. If the ccTLD operated by the commercial company, and actually we know that several of the ccTLD already operate by a commercial company, how to protect my and the company interest? And maybe some of you can answer the question is how many countries have particularly regulation more than just a UDRP. This term will be Kenny first, and then Bruce, and then Eamon. Kenny, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm just curious, probably Chair copied a question from previous slide. So,
No.
nothing
No,
related to the topic.
No, I'm thinking about that is some of the related issue in this section. Yeah, anyway, you can skip. You already answered.
Okay. Anyway, I try to refocus on the subtopic: dominant confusion, malware, botnet, phishing, farming, and spam. And probably like Bruce or Eamon can add a little bit about how we're handling dominant abuse. Okay, back to starting from number D, how GDPR apply to dominant space or apply for GAC, CCNSO. I think GDPR is a common practice, although the regulation was developed by European Commission, but the legal effect actually imply that will impact a global cyberspace, because anyone who run in the gTLD or ccTLD, if they have any registrant come from European, then they need to follow the rule. Otherwise, they will be penalized by the outcome. For example, like a TWIGF, we are running the .tw, but even though we are outside the jurisdiction of Europe, but we still need to try our best effort to comply with the GDPR legal requirement. For example, we have around 25,000 European registrants, and we also need to protect we also need to comply with the GDPR requirement. That means we cannot disclose their personal information unless we have their consent first. So the 25,000 registrants, initially we just mask their registration information from the WHOIS database systems. I believe most of the ccTLD or gTLD operators are doing a very similar exercise as we did. So they try to protect the registrant from European and try to comply with the GDPR requirement. I think the impact will be a global-wise impact, and so that's why I can also study on how to revise the WHOIS policy and how to comply not only with the GDPR, try to comply with a specific requirement from certain region if they have similar request. That's why I try to separate, for example, like who are eligible to access the registration database, and how to accredit the government authorized agent. For example, you are a law enforcement agent, you probably have a right to access to the database once you have passed some accreditation, and you can access the database to obtain registration information in order to prevent some cybercrime. So let's find that's what ICANN do and GDPR do, and they also have several discussions. And probably Eamon or Bruce can mention a little bit what will be the next step or who is database registration policies. And could search engine ranking ccTLD or gTLD? Of course, but the search engine, the algorithm inside the search engine is not accountable. It's not public aware information. So there's no way we can try to join, for example, joint discussion about the search engine policy. How can they rank in this kind of information? And they could, but we don't have too much information about how they do. Okay, last one. If ccTLD operate by commercial company, how to protect the company interest? That's also a very strange question. Yes, there are several ccTLD actually was running by commercial companies. And for example, the most popular was, as you mentioned, TV.tv. And the .tv right now was managed by, I think it's Amazon. I'm not sure, probably you can
VeriSign, yeah.
Amazon, yes, Amazon. I remember Amazon paid $5 million annually to Valo and to obtain the right to operate. I believe the country, the Tuvalu, when they outsource CCTLD operation to any third-party operator, they already define what sort of legal requirement they need as a basic foundation before they launch the commercial service. I believe they should be able to have some registry operator agreement with the authority, a local authority as well. And so everything just follow the rule. If they have the agreement, if any dispute, any legal right abuse, you can follow the agreement, how they document inside the agreement, follow the dispute resolution procedure. I think that's a best practice in the commercial world, even they are operated by commercial operator. So anyway, the question, none of the question relate to DNS abuse anyway.
Okay. Okay. The next one is Bruce. You can skip the first 3 questions. And you also, if you like, you can explain about the domain name abuse too. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so skipping the first 3 questions, on question D, which is GDPR. So GDPR is a law in Europe which is intended to protect the privacy of individuals. And I think the challenges with the WHOIS service is because most registrars don't distinguish between an individual and a company or a not-for-profit organisation. They have just decided to treat everybody as an individual and therefore block the domain registration information. Certainly, in Australia we take a different view. So we actually we have different namespaces like com.au, and we require people to be a registered business to operate in com.au. And because it is a registered business, we then publish the information on the name of that business and their contact details. So ultimately, I think where WHOIS needs to head is to properly distinguish between an individual that's registering a domain name for personal reasons, so for family photos, that sort of thing, versus somebody registering a name for commercial purposes. And I think if the name is being registered for commercial purposes, there should be an obligation to disclose the identity of the person that's operating that name and their contact information. So ultimately, I think it's about distinguishing between individuals and companies. What I see happening at a regulatory level is that governments are starting to regulate in this space. So, for example, there is a cybercrime convention called the Budapest Convention that was agreed some years ago by governments. My understanding is that those same governments are looking to update that so that one government can request the WHOIS information from the companies that are operating of another government. And ultimately, I think if the internet community doesn't sort of solve this WHOIS challenge, then governments will, and it'll be a very piecemeal solution, and it will be expensive for registries and registrars to manage. So I think that's the downside there. On E, the search engine ranking, it's interesting, and I think every new top-level name operator would like to go to Google and say, look, if someone's searching for wine, only show them results for .wine. Or if someone's looking for a tea to drink, then only show them .tea. I think the reality is that search engines are agnostic. So they will rank whatever the site is that's most popular. If that site's in .com or .tw for Taiwan or .wine, and it's about the wine industry, they will pick whichever's the most popular name. And I don't think the search engine cares whether it's a gTLD or a CCTLD. And I think that's where that will continue. If CC is operated by commercial companies, again, I think this is similar to any issue of protecting your brand. It's really where's your customers. So if you're a company that is, say you take Qantas as an Australian airline, and you want people in different countries to choose the airline, then if you've got flights to London, then you probably need to protect Qantas as a brand name in the UK because that's where some of your customers are. if you've got flights to Taiwan, then you probably want to have Qantas registered in Taiwan. So I think ultimately as a business, it's identify where do your customers go. If your customers commonly purchase products from a particular CCTLD or gTLD, then register there. A little bit how the search engines treat it. Be agnostic. The search engine just chooses the search results of what's the most popular sites. You as a small business, you just need to be present where your customers are, and if they're in a marketplace like eBay, or they're in a country code like .uk or .taiwan, then that's where you need to register your domain name.
Okay.
So that's
Eamon?
all from me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take it kind of in the reverse order and building on what Bruce just left off.
Okay.
I very much agree with the suggestion about where your customers are and where your customer communities are. Those are the TLDs that is relevant for you to protect, and not just protect, because I actually don't really like the concept of protecting just protection for protection purposes, because you can actually put it to use. I take a slightly different view in terms of the redirection. I think redirection is legitimate use, because it's that's the reason why those bit.ly things work, because it's a short URL that people can use. That is a legitimate use. A redirection purpose of domain names shouldn't be a second-class citizen in my mind. But building on that, actually, about 12 years ago when .asia started, we early in the days that we started, we commissioned a study on like what does TLD matter in the search engine optimization part. What we found is quite interesting. It is that it does make a difference when all things being equal. What is interesting is that if you're searching from Hong Kong, .hk actually ranks a little bit better, and then .asia, and then .com. In Taiwan, it would be the same. If you're situated in Taiwan, and all things being equal, .tw actually ranks slightly higher than .asia and then .com and generic top-level domains. This is one way of thinking about it. And then, of course, if the TLD matches a search term that's what people are looking for, that helps a little bit as well. So those are some of the interesting things. But ultimately, yes, I think the general thing is that if you think that the search engine, getting the best domain is going to like change everything about search engine optimization, that's not true, because the site, the content is much more important. But the domain does play a little bit of a role. Circling back to some of the questions, actually, on GDPR, I agree very much with what Bruce mentioned. The relevance is on personal versus company contact information. If it's a personal registration, which domain names are increasingly being used for, then protection is important. And I think GDPR, to me, working more on the, I guess, not the really activist, but at least for fighting for human rights part of me, believe that it's a genuine attempt to tilt the balance back to the personal end users, because in the past 20 years, the internet has been driven by commercial interests much more, and privacy has not been the top of mind. GDPR, I think, is a genuine attempt to push that balance back to privacy and back to users. Is it very successful? I think it remains to be seen. But what Bruce touched on, I think, is most relevant for this community and ICANN, is that these are some of the things like the WHOIS issue in terms of privacy is something we have to solve. If we don't solve it, the governments will solve it for us, and we might not like that that resolution. Early on in ICANN, what was very successful, I think, was UDRP, the Uniform Dispute Resolution Policy, that in fact the ICANN community created, and the governments around the world adopt it. This is, I think, a great success story for early at ICANN, and here's an opportunity for us to really think through the WHOIS policies that could potentially do the same. If we do it right and do it well, I think the CCTLDs and the governments around the world would take that and utilize it, just like what the UDRP actually accomplished in the early days of ICANN, and still continues to be so. This brings me to, I guess, the top line question, which is domain name abuse, and this. In fact, actually, your question C arguably is somewhat related to domain abuse, because one of the reasons for domain name to be suspended could be that they're in this abuse. They're aligned with abuse. This is a topic that is really interesting because in the ICANN ecosystem, like the ICANN community, 10 years ago, I was just looking at some of the notes maybe a couple months ago when domain name abuse, I need to speak about domain name abuse. I realized that 10 years ago, there was domain name abuse discussion. But at that time, the registries and registrars, were like, we're never going to talk about this. This is about content. We will not touch it with a 10-foot pole. Now is a completely different scenario. Everyone is talking about it, and everyone realized that something has to be done. And there's still people who say that trademark and DNS abuse is a completely different thing. I don't disagree that they're technically different. But if you look at phishing, how does phishing work? Of course, you use somebody else's trademark, right? I mean, you're trying to come off as that company. But that's not an UDRP issue, but a DNS abuse issue. Now, the lines start to blur when you start thinking about those issues. And the reason why 10 years ago people don't want to touch it is because it's a very difficult engineering problem.
Yeah.
But it is not an engineering problem. It's a policy problem. It's a policy issue, how we deal with these type of abuses. And this question about content and what ICANN should touch and should not touch is not as clear cut as we want it to be. I think when we say we won't we don't quote unquote regulate content, but how do you distinguish between a phishing site or not a phishing site? You look at the content, right? You have to look at the content. So in some ways, content is unavoidable. And the funny thing to me, early on, we talked about why domain names are still relevant. I talked about that it's the name, the identity, but that's also text. So let's say a whole domain with let's say you take a song, all the lyrics, and put it in the very long domain name. Is that content or is that name? Right? I mean, the lines actually blur so much that it's difficult. For the ICANN community, though, one of the biggest topic about domain name abuse and why it's a hot topic in my mind is that because of this blurriness, but also because what ICANN can actually do and what ICANN cannot do. And I think the reality is that there is a lot of relevance of DNS abuse at ICANN and within the ICANN community and within the ICANN policy processes. However, the actual policies that ICANN can put in place to mitigate against domain name abuse is very limited, because most of the abuse is not directly related to the DNS and the ecosystem of the registries and registrars. So therein lies the difficulty. It's so related to domain name, yet ICANN can do so little. And I think that's really the reason why it has become a hot topic. And I think until we figure out and are willing to take up that little small part and actually think through what the policies should be, and then building on that to go to other communities to talk about domain name abuse and get them involved. And that I think is the is the direction. And I think the general consensus seems to be, shaping towards that as well. And I think going forward, DNS and domain name abuse will continue to be a topic. And again, this, like the GDPR, like the WHO, is something that ICANN needs to be proactively, and the ICANN community, I believe, needs to be proactively involved. And the policies that we do here is maybe a small part, but it should have ripple effects to other communities as well.
Thank you, Eamon. At least Eamon helped me to solving the domain name abuse question. Okay, let's go to the next session. The next session, actually, I only reserved 6 minutes. It's IDN and IDN variants. I think there's a very good part for Kenny and Eamon, but let me start from Bruce. Bruce, you are the first talking about IDN and IDN variants.
Interesting. Well, I can say
no question here.
Yeah. Well, I can say at least at .au, we're planning to introduce IDNs within .au because Australia has a lot of people that speak different languages. So we're looking to add Chinese language domain names within .au, for example. I think the challenges with IDNs are still very much, I guess, educating users and how they work and how it works in browsers and how it works in things like email. So I think it's still very early days. Although there are definitely security issues around things like IDN variants where a particular, let's say it was a Chinese character, that there are multiple Chinese characters that look similar to each other, as there are with Latin characters. So if you look at the letter L and the letter I, depending on what script or font you're using, they can look pretty similar. Or the number 0 or the letter 0 can look similar. So there's nothing new about characters looking similar. And I'd certainly think if a bank was choosing a particular name, they want to choose a name that's made up of characters that are fairly unique and not easy to confuse with other characters. But I think it's far less of an issue compared to the issue with just getting people used to using IDNs as a domain name in both their website address and their email address. So yeah, I'm certainly not the expert in this field, so leave it to others to talk further, Kwai.
But you are going to do the business on IDN, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, the next one is Eamon, and that is your favorite.
Yeah, definitely my favorite topic. And this is the topic that brought me to ICANN 20 years ago. And speaking of that, actually, earlier in the session, you mentioned that the DNS was put in place in 1983. 20 years later, in 2003, that was when the IDN standards were put in place. Now, almost 20 years later, we're still talking about early days, which is kind of interesting because even though, yes, IDN seems to be new and we're still just talking about IDN variants at the top level domain, the PDP, the policy development process, is just starting at ICANN now. But it's half of the history of the DNS. There has been IDNs. This is something that I think should put things into perspective. I think to me, what Bruce mentioned is actually true, unfortunately, because it's the concept of early days is that because what is called universal acceptance, the actual practical usage of IDNs is not fully in place in the infrastructure yet, and I think that's where the bigger effort needs to be. And I'm glad that I've been helping the formation of the universal acceptance steering group and a lot of the work that is going on there, because until when the young kids that learn internet network connectivity in like maybe primary school, knows about IDN and really sees it as not an additional thing to the English IDNs, that's when IDNs will become, universally accepted in my mind. But right now, actually, just a few days ago, I was reviewing some of the textbooks in Hong Kong. They don't have IDNs. They talk about DNS, like the secondary school textbooks. They talk about DNS and email addresses, but none of it includes IDN or international email address. Why? Well, I guess we all know why, but that's where I think the bigger needs to be. But I guess as a little bit of a advertisement, the IDN policy development process for variants at the top level domain, I think is very important, because just take Hong Kong as an example. There is a Chinese top level domain that is having some problems in Hong Kong because they only have the simplified Chinese, which is used in mainland China. But here in Hong Kong, most people we would feel much more comfortable using the traditional Chinese version, and therefore that TLD would not be successful at all in Hong Kong. In fact, with some of the politics that are happening, it's actually detrimental to some of the brands if they start featuring a simplified Chinese domain, which is the reason why IDN variants needs to be solved. And the policy development process is finally beginning after more than 10 years in the making, and I'm quite honored and blessed to be helping chair that GNSO PDP. So please participate, even if you are not even if you're not an official member from a stakeholder group. It's actually open for participation from anyone, and all the voices about how we deal with IDN variants on the top level, I think are important for IDNs to be actually useful.
Okay, now it's a troublemaker. It's a Kenny Huang. He favored IDN variants. So it's your turn, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Just one minor message to Eamon, and be patient, because the protocol grow up take times. For example, I take one example, like IPv6. IPv6 was developed 25 years ago, and even today, IPv6 still considered very advanced technology to most of the operators still. And although IDN was developed almost 20 years ago, but still quite modern protocol from all the registrar, they consider IDN is very, very complicated. Even for ICANN, IDN is very complicated issue, not only technology, but also the policy and provisioning. Everything was so complicated, not to mention about a dispute resolution. So anyway, but fortunately, there's no much technology issue. It's just probably a little bit. And because I can already develop, Edmund and I are working in the Chinese label generation rule, and I can already develop label generation rule and try to put an IDN variant into a root zone, follow the rule, as long as they follow the rule. And also, there are different efforts in the GNSO and CCNSO. For example, like I'm working on GNSO, working on IDN related policies. And CCN also form a CCPDP, that's country code IDN, country code policy development process for IDN. I'm the chair for CCPDP4 and working on the policy related policy. But things quite interesting, because CCNSO already some country already allocate IDN probably 10 years ago, and that's going through a IDN fast track program. I can call it fast track because they don't have very formal procedure how to allocate IDN to specific country. For example, that also screw up all the another confusion, because I can only allocate stream to ISO 3166 as long as your country code list in ISO 3166. You are eligible to allocate a country code, and as long as you get your support from local authorities. But for IDN, there's no such stream in the ISO 3166. So we need to develop something new, something related, probably have some relation with 3166. So that's what we're trying to do put my head as a chair of CCPDP4. We set up a working group, several working group working on the similar issues. For example, we set up the variant management working group, try to identify the variant issues and what kind of variant issue required in different IDN, in Indian, in Chinese, in Korean, in Thai, or in different kind of language. And do we have a common set of variant management tool or variant management rule to manage all kind of IDN in the root zone? And also we identify, and we have IDN create a security issue, as Bruce mentioned. So we identified, we try to create another sub-working group called Confusion Similarity Sub-Working Group that were working on how do we solve the similarity issues. And the last working group, sub-working group we try to create is a selection and deselection working group. That means, in some country, we need to identify the policy who are eligible to allocate, to submit their application to apply for IDN CCTLD. And any eligibility, any criteria they require to get an ITN from the ICANN. So we tried, the working group tried to work on the policy related issue, try to develop a set of rules to see who are eligible, who are ineligible to apply the IDN CCTLD. And also all the effort will also join together with this GNSO as long as GNOs. And so also working on string similarity and IDN variant. That's all very technical issues. They are highly correlated to each other. So for that kind of area, more related to technical area, we're working together with the GNSO and try to develop the common set of technical criterion as well. So just last word, be patient. We're still quite young for IDN, even only 20 years. I think we have another 30 years to develop that kind of policy. Anyway.
Okay, good luck. Okay, let's go to the last session. And here, let me see. Oh, why can I move my slide? Where's my slide? Where's my slide? Huh? No, don't do that. Okay, let me see, where is my slide? I cannot move my slide.
It's okay.
Well,
last one will be group discussion.
Yes, not yet. The next session actually is 11:20 to 11:40 will be the future development. And before we started, I'd like to invite another speaker. It's Jialong Lo. It's ICANN VP in the Asia Pacific. Jialong, can you say something? Jialong.
Hello. Can everybody hear me?
Hello. Ah, we saw you. Okay, good. Go ahead, say hello to. And the last session actually basically have a couple of the questions. The first question is, what is the progress for the next round of the new gTLD program? Since 2016, I think the people asking about what's going on in the next round for the new gTLD. The second question is, some people asking, what is the relationship between the ICANN and the United Nations? The number 3, the question is interesting. It's how the CCTLD can withdraw from the domain name space. Number 4 question is a UDRP. If the UDRP is not sufficient to protect the registrant interest, what can I do? And actually, in the preview, I think Bruce talking about this, some of the government have regulation. but you can add a little bit more. The last question is, what is the most critical issue for ICANN now and the future? Is accountability or resolve the domain name dispute issue, or how to balance the government, technical, public sector, civil society, internet user. So in here, because we have a new speaker join in, is the ICANN representative, is Asia Pacific VP, Vice President. Jialong, you like to comment about what is the domain name future development?
Thank you, Koei. Koei, your slides are on the screen now. Do you mind scrolling to the slide with the questions?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Good. Can you see it? Can you see it?
I can see the slides, but it's not at the slide with the questions under future development section.
This is the one.
So what I see is the ID variant slide.
This is a bad one. I don't know what's going on. This doesn't move.
There it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.
Okay.
Go
I
ahead.
think this will help everyone as well because there's quite a lot of questions. So for the first question, what is the progress for the next round? I will send a link here. So the ICANN community at the GNSO has completed its work. The working group has completed the work. You've heard the other speakers mention as well, sub-pro, subsequent procedures. That is the working group that works on what do we do for the next round. So it's subsequent procedures of new generic top-level domains. And the working group has completed the work. They've submitted the final report. It is sitting with the ICANN board. And what the ICANN board now is considering is they want to do like a operational design phase, which in layman term is kind of like a feasibility study. So do a feasibility study to see, what can or needs to be done, what is the cost, so it can help the ICANN board make a decision whether to adopt the final report in its entirety or adopt the report in different portions. So that is where the current situation is, and the operational design phase, which is the feasibility study I mentioned, is still being scoped out at this point. And thanks, Pam, for sharing a recent blog on this. So that's where we are at this point. So once we have a clear timeline for the operational design phase and the amount of time it will take, then from the time the board then decides whether it will adopt the recommendation, assuming it goes through, then usually it takes another 18 months or so before the rolling out of the next round. So it could be any time at this timeline, sometime about 2 years from now, before we see the possibility of a next round. So that's where we are currently. But really very good work with regard to the subsequent procedures, PDP. There's some very good recommendations. So really looking forward to how things are going to move. And tied to this, just a quick comment on the next round. So within our region, the next round ties in very strongly with the rolling out of IDNs. So I want to make a quick comment on this one, because when we have the next round, it means that we, especially for our region, it would mean the rolling out of IDNs, and it means the availing of IDNs for the community here in the region. And a lot of us speak different languages, we use different languages, we have specific communities that only use a language that is non-English. So it really talks about very important milestone for our community here in Asia Pacific. And between now to the next round, this is a good time for us to collaborate and work together to let people know more about IDNs. And that will help us like Penny said, we have to be very patient, right? So it's better we start the work now and we work towards the awareness for when the time we can roll out the next round, then people will be much more ready for implementing IDNs in their systems at the time. So IDNs is one key milestone. The other one is also universal acceptance. It's tied together because current systems, the browsers, the software, email, not all of them accept domain names that's longer than what we conventionally know, and even worse, IDNs specifically. So this is a good time for us to start thinking about how we can collaborate, not just in raising awareness, but also in thinking about how can we help both at the policy level and also in the industry at the industry level to support each other in a certain ecosystem that allows the development of IDNs to grow very quickly when we can roll out the next round. So these are some key questions for us to think about. And these will be key for us as a community in the next few years. So this is question A. Question B is completely unrelated to question A. What is the relationship between ICANN and the UN? Okay, so I mean, the UN is a members organization. It is an organization made up of nation states. And ICANN's relationship with nation states is that of the Government Advisory Committee. So almost all nation states are members. We have like 170 members last I remember. So our relationship with the governments is directly through the Government Advisory Committee. Through that, right, we have an indirect relationship with the UN. Now, with the UN itself, ICANN doesn't have too many direct relationships. We have more relationships with bodies under the UN. So, for example, we are a member of the ITUD, the International Telecommunications Union. So we are a member there. We also support very strongly the Global Internet Governance Forum, the UN IGF. And the Internet Governance Forum is also an initiative of the UN. So ICANN's relationship with the UN is through some of these bodies, which we either collaborate as members or we support very strongly directly. So for example, in the IGF. So that's the second, I think that's pretty much covers the second question.
Yeah.
Okay, now for C, how can CCTLDs withdraw from the domain name space? So Kenny talked about this a little bit. Basically, if you are CCTLD, if you are a country and you have a 2-letter character in ISO 3166, you are eligible to run your own CCTLD. So the question then comes to, what happens if a certain country no longer exists or the name change? What happens if those things come together? So the development of policy related to CCTLDs largely is just CCTLDs deciding their own policy. But in this case, it is something that's kind of above and beyond the CCTLD itself. So discussions like these happen at ICANN in a group called the CCNSO, the Country Code Name Supporting Organization, as typed here in short form. And they recently completed this work as well on retirement of CCTLDs. So it's here in the report. Very good work again from the CC community. Basically, the CCTLD, if they were to want to retire, they have to notify ANA 5 years in advance. Then make sure that they will do a kind of transition, and then they will exit at the 5-year mark. So that's a very, very short summary of what it is. But for those who are more interested in this, you can go in to see the detail for the final report. So that's I think answers question C. question D, when UDRP is not sufficient to protect registrar's interests, what can I do? Any new policy that can be developed in ICANN? Now, the UDRP, incidentally, is, for some background, is the very first consensus policy developed by the ICANN community. So we've had it for since 1998. We've had it for over 20 years. And in fact, I would say it still remains the most successful policy ICANN has made because it's in a way universally accepted as best practice that is used globally in the gTLD space. A lot of ccTLDs also adopt UDRP. UDRP was meant to be a complementary process, in fact, to protect registrar's interests when it comes to trademarks. Because traditionally, if someone were to infringe on my trademark, I have to go and sue this person in court. But it can only happen if it's in my own country. Or alternatively, it's for me to go and sue this person in the country where they reside. So let's say if a US company were to infringe on my trademark here in Singapore, I can try to sue them in the US, but it's very expensive and it doesn't always work because trademarks are within a certain jurisdiction. So in a way, UDRP has been seen as the means to fully cover registrar's interests, whereas in the past, there wouldn't be. Now, is it fully sufficient to protect registrar's interests? There's different views to this. But largely, one important work that is happening in the ICANN community is the review of rights protection mechanisms. I'm just going to type it here. So this work is ongoing. There are two phases. The first phase is Kenny also mentioned in his previous remarks about with the new gTLD program, there were some new rights protection mechanisms that came up. That review of those new gTLD right protection mechanisms is already done. Then what's going to happen next is a review of the UDRP itself. So this is where I'd like to make a call for action to everyone listening in this space and to let your friends and colleagues know as well. It's really to think about, can we participate in this UDRP review and how can we make it better? Then a lot of the typical participants in UDRP would be from the law community because of the trademark copyright aspect. Then, of course, the registries and registrars. But a very interesting perspective to think about, and it's a question here that you raised, is where do registrants raise their voice? And how do registrants tell the ICANN community that this is their interest? It's not very clear. And perhaps it is a good opportunity for us to think about, okay, how can we help to facilitate for registrants' interest to be heard? And in ICANN, there is also a group which is the at-large community, the end-user community, but end users are not directly the same as registrants. So it's very interesting that if you have registered a domain name, you're a registrant. Do you feel that your interests are sufficiently protected by UDRP? And something that we would be very interested to learn about. So I think that covers question D. And as for the last one, question E, what are the most critical issues? There are quite a number actually. If it's about issues, right? So I talked about IDNs and universal acceptance and the next round. I think that's pretty critical for us within the region. At the recent ICANN meeting, our CEO Yoran also talked about the next round, and it's interesting. Couple interesting points he made. One of them is the internet we created, designed, and developed it to be interoperable. and it's an interoperability of machines. So anyone joining the network, my computer or device can connect to your computer or device. The next round, what it could potentially mean is the interoperability of people, because language and scripts no longer become a barrier for people to get on the internet. I think that's a very meaningful way to look at the DNS infrastructure as a means to remove barriers. So it is quite a relevant and critical issue for us, I feel, especially when we talk about getting the next billion of people online. So that is an important aspect.
Thank you.
Second important aspect is like what Edmund mentioned on DNS abuse. It is important because, even 10 years ago, DNS, or rather security, is not something that is a basic requirement. But fast forward 10 years today, I want to make sure that, my systems are protected, at least to a certain extent. So security now is seen as a basic requirement. And when you tie in security to what people feel is a requirement, then naturally DNS abuse becomes a part of the conversation. But it's a very complicated conversation, like Emma mentioned, because the blurring of the lines of what is content and what is not. And therefore, in ICANN's remit, is this something ICANN can do or cannot do? And it's very, very complicated because the community has very different views about this. And I've also heard, some people say, then can someone just make a decision about it? But in the model of which ICANN is governed, the multi-stakeholder model, you can't have one person make a decision about this, which is why it then becomes more complicated. And in a way, it ties to the third point on what is another critical issue. It is the question of the multi-stakeholder model. Is it working in ICANN, and will it continue to work? And the short answer really is, actually, if we look back the past 20 years, the stakeholder model in ICANN has worked pretty well. And it continues to be a good reference point. But is it the most efficient? Is it the most effective? Maybe not. And it will continue to be a question for all of us to consider, and for us to continue to work together to evolve the model. So this is also a critical issue, because if as a community we're not able to adapt to the issues of the day, the challenges that we are facing, then we become irrelevant. So it also is a key issue. So I would stop there,
Okay, thank you.
Listing top 3 issues just for for us to take note.
Yeah. I think the next one will be Eamon and Kenny, and then the Bruce. Is that possible for each of you using 3 minutes, so we are not going to overrun the session? Eamon, please.
Right. So briefly, I guess agree a lot with what Jarong has already mentioned. In terms of the next round of new gTLDs, that's a very interesting thing. It's everyone's guess. There should be like a betting pool. It's like, when is it going to happen? I from Jarong, what Jarong mentioned, at least 2 years. Well, that means probably 4 or more when you think about ICANN time. Right.
Yes.
And what I heard,
it's the opposite of dog time, isn't it?
Exactly. When we were in the 2012, before the 2012 round, there's always been this 9-month thing. Every time ICANN comes out, it's like 9 months later. It's like giving birth. Now what I hear Jarong say is like 18 months later. Even when everything is ready, it's 18 months later. So doubling it is probably a good way to think about it. So joking aside, I think it's important to bring it out, and I think the IDN portion is definitely going to be the relevant one, especially for this region in Asia. the relationship between ICANN and UN, that's a very curious question. There's no relationship at all. We hate each other. No, of course not. That's the I think it's very interesting because the way I see it is that it's really it's almost the opposite model of UN. UN is government driven, and earlier we mentioned that the governments are involved at ICANN, but when you look at the ICANN board composition, the governments actually put the one person in the board, but he or she is non-voting at the ICANN board, which is a very interesting. It's almost the opposite of UN. But this is where I think the relationship should be built. I think in the early days there is actually a very I wouldn't say animosity, but at least there was some tension. I think that tension that tension can continue, but the relationship should actually be built. That would be my view, because going forward, the community would need the governments to be an active part of the ICANN community as well for ICANN itself to be effective. And that's in my mind. CCTLD's withdrawal, I guess when countries get merged, that changes. Hopefully, Hong Kong still has our TLD for a very long time to go, and well, so I won't touch on that topic. I mentioned about UDRP earlier. Yes, I think Jarung is quite right. That's one of the early successes of ICANN, and in fact, it is the most successful policy that was put in place, I believe. And earlier I said I think that we need to try to replicate that success with how we deal with the WHOIS data and how we deal with DNS abuse. But realistically, about specifically for protecting registrants' interests and rights, if you will, I don't think a kind of completely new policy needs to be in place. I think we can tweak what is already in place with the rights protection mechanisms. So that's sort of how I see it. And most critical issues already mentioned: IDN, DNS abuse, WHOIS stuff, need to resolve this, and the relationship with governments. Those are, I think, top of mind.
Okay, the next one is Kenny.
Okay, thank you. I believe most of the questions
3 minutes, please.
Answered.
Yeah.
Okay, right. I believe most of the questions have already been answered. Just add a few more things. What's the progress for new gTLD? And Jarung already mentioned another 18 months. And I hope that the figure can be more reduced because a lot of people ask for similar question. And actually, there are several big companies in Taiwan. They went to us and they request us provide information about a new gTLD. For example, like how important the new gTLD is, how can it apply for new gTLD, how to manage the DNS in the root zone. And when I hear their story, I only have one recommendation to them. Please don't submit your application. You certainly will die. If you submit it, if you only have very, very limited knowledge of gTLD and DNS operations, you certainly will die in the cyberspace. So anyway, if you have early schedule, please let the stakeholder know as soon as possible, because the preparation, consultation, making proposal, prepare all the technical requirements take time. So you better allow the people to know the schedule as soon as possible. And so second question, any relationship, Eamon already mentioned, there's no relationship between ICANN and UN. What I can need from UN is nothing. I can need nothing from UN. And UN require anything from ICANN, especially all the internet governance feature. And that's certainly UN require that kind of power. And how CCTLD withdraw, and Jarung already mentioned, and they are retirement program. And if they are willing to retire, they can retire. If they are not really willing to retire, still retire. Right? Okay, if UDRP are sufficient, of course not sufficient, but I can already roll out several programs. Like I can have a US Unified Rapid Suspension. I can have a TMCH trademark period in-house. I can have a required gTLD has a sunrise registration, has a land rush, or has any kind of right protection mechanism for new applicant. I believe currently already have several mechanisms to protect the trademark and the legal right. Okay, what would be the most critical issue for ICANN? As Charlotte mentioned, IDN and UA, and also Emma mentioned this too. But anyway, I can spend a lot of effort to promote IDN and also UA, but most of the stakeholders that doesn't probably not acquire, probably not realize how important the IDN or how important the UA is. But anyway, it's an infrastructure. As I mentioned, as long as it is infrastructure, it takes time to grow up. It probably takes time for another 10 years, 20 years. Anyway, as long as you has the power to provide a service, as long as the stakeholder require it, they can request for that kind of service. Okay, that's my final note.
Okay, I think Bruce, your last one. I expecting you to answer the second question and might be the third one, because if I remember in the guidebook, we writing for the withdrawal for the new gTLDs. Bruce, your turn.
Thank you, Kuwait. Well, I might actually start with the first one because I think it relates to progress. So what I think is really happening there is that the new gTLD program has been held to ransom by people that are frustrated with the lack of progress in other areas. So people keep saying, oh, we can't have new gTLDs because they cause DNS abuse. That's not true. And in fact, the new gTLDs has made a very minimal contribution to DNS abuse. It's mostly occurring in existing top-level names. But because people are not getting any progress in dealing with DNS abuse in existing top-level domains, they're going, oh, we can't do anything until we've solved that. I would have liked to see ICANN take a lot more of an agile, iterative approach to the new gTLD program. So it should have been introducing names every year since 2012 and gradually been improving the guidebook each year. And if it had done that, then I think it would have been effective. On the second topic between ICANN and UN, really, I think it's between countries where they have companies that have done very well out of internet technology versus countries where they don't feel that their citizens or companies have done well. And that I think is ultimately the tension. And so you'll find countries like the US support the ICANN because their communities made a lot of money out of the internet, whereas countries in other parts of the world, there's minimal impact in terms of improvement to their country based on the internet. They make more money from oil and other things, but internet's not one of those, and so they feel left out. And so I think they'll continue to push for the UN model because they feel that they can have a greater say. On the third one, I think others have spoken to that, but I think ultimately when a country ceases to exist and falls out of the ISO list, then it ceases to be a country code. The couple of examples that I know of in the recent, my lifetime anyway, I guess is the Soviet Union with .su and Yugoslavia with .yu, where effectively they've broken up into their independent countries, and so those country codes have been withdrawn. But it's a 10-year process, which sort of makes sense, especially when you think of new registrations often have a 10-year lifetime. UDRP, ultimately, I think that does very well for trademark holders. What we probably are not doing so well is the degree of how we deal with what I'll call sort of deceptive and misleading conduct. And I think there are different laws around the world that deal with that. But to the extent that ICANN could look at coming up with some simplified dispute resolution process that's based on international law, I think that would be good. Most critical issues for ICANN, I think, it's very interesting as you listen to other speakers there, but ultimately I think it's probably the balance between privacy and human rights on one side and consumer safety on the other. And it's a little bit like the rules of the road in terms of cars. You know, have a set of users that can be held accountable. They drive around with cars with a number plate. If they break the law, they can be reported based on that number plate. It's effectively like a domain name. But there's a government database that's reliable that identifies who's actually owning that car. And on a safety point of view, most people are quite comfortable walking along the side of the road with their children on a footpath, which is only meters away from cars travelling at high speed that can kill those children. But you trust that it's safe because people are obeying the laws. And I think ultimately we've got to get to the mode where people can be held accountable for their use of online resources, whether it's a domain name or a website address or an email address, and that if you do break the law, you can be held accountable. So I think that's really the challenge going forward. So that's all from me, Kawai.
Okay, thank you. Then let's go to the final one, the QA. We only have 10 minutes left. So anybody want to ask the question, please raise your hand. By the way, the friend is modifying my question. He say, what is the relationship between the ICANN and UNIGF? Bruce, can you answer that? UNIGF and the ICANN.
I guess I've never been to an IGF actually, so but I've been to lots.
I know
of
you don't. You are not interested at all.
Yeah, that's right. But, look, I think at the end of the day, even though ICANN's slow, it's still a decision-making forum, and in the end, it creates policies. Whereas IGF is not a decision-making forum, but it's intended as an area where people can share ideas. Ultimately, though, I think that the governments have not found that to be useful and are just proceeding towards traditional sort of national legislation and treaties.
Okay, here is one question is Luby Pan. Can you speak?
Yes, hi everyone.
Luby.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you for the sharing. It's so insightful to me. So I just want to ask a question about you guys share about a lot of the critical issue that ICANN is working on. For example, the DNS bills, the next run, the who status. So I just want to see are there any priority around the ICANN committee or the ICANN board, like towards this or this critical issue, which one actually should be prioritized? Thank you.
Who want to first? Bruce, go ahead.
Well, I think priority is one of the big struggles at ICANN because there is no priority. In terms of what I think the priority should be, I do think ICANN needs to solve the who is issue. I think that's critical really to ICANN continuing to be relevant.
Okay, Jialong, what about your priority? I think 4 speakers will be 4 different priorities. So.
Actually, my answer is the same as Bruce's. This is the challenge the ICANN community is facing right now. So there's quite a lot of discussion about, okay, how can we prioritize better? Pam raised her hand. She might talk about this. So like the GNSO Council, they're looking at, okay, how do we develop like a framework for us to push some of the work out more quickly? So those are some of the issues that are being discussed within the ICANN community. It is a big challenge.
Okay. Eamon, what is your priority? Eamon.
I actually agree with Bruce, but I would, like ICANN, I have a multiple priorities. I think universal acceptance, I think to me is a very important part, and it actually, strategically speaking, it could connect ICANN with the local governments and communities much stronger. So, and that also has some relation with the who is issue, but definitely, we have to solve this who is thing quickly, as multiple people mentioned that, or else someone else will solve it for us.
Kenny, what is your priorities?
I agree with most of your proposal. I think the most important priority will be a legal concern. whois database will be certainly the most important priority. But I probably have a little bit different view compared to the others, because ICANN actually can have a position in whois. They can also step down outside the position of whois, because according to existing community proposal, and that require a lot of work to be done inside the ICANN umbrella, and because of too much work to be done. So probably I can just walk away and go back to the original whois, and any dispute happen, just go through legal process. That's my concern.
Okay, the next question is from Pen. Pen, please.
Thank you, Guowei. Thank you, Guowei. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great.
Yes.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this session. I have enjoyed it, very informative, and all the panelists' views and discussion. I just want to share with you all about the UDRP review that was mentioned a few times. The council is really looking at how to go about this UDRP review policy work. And folks also talked about prioritization. And definitely we're taking all this into account. So where council is at with UDRP review, which will be phase 2 of the review of all rights protection mechanism, PDP, is actually probably going to be a few months away, if not more, because the staff has pointed out the bandwidth issue everyone has talked about. You know, there's so much on everyone's plate at the moment. So there's a community volunteers resources as well as ICANN org or ICANN support staff's resources, whether we have resources to do this review right now. The other more important issue or consideration is there wasn't a UDRP issue report that was done back in 2011, and it's sort of 10 years old. So there might be new issues came up or new data need to be collected. So, and the other thing is the PDP 3.0 improvements. We want this new charter for the review of UDRP to incorporate many of those principles or improvements in the PDP 3.0 exercise. So all in all, the council is likely to agree to actually request a policy status report to be prepared by ICANN org, and then looked at that and then go into the chartering exercise for the review of UDRP policy. I'm so sorry if that was what you were expecting in terms of timeline, but it's really a difficult juggling exercise. But we are probably looking at if the council decides to go down that path, will be at least I estimate 9 to 12 months before we see this effort kicked off. Thank you for allowing me to share that. Thanks.
Okay. So any add-on comment, or we want to listen to another question? Let's go another question. Luby, is you again?
Yes. Thank you for okay, so can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Thank you for answering my question about the priority thing. So just want to continue the follow-up with it, like as you mentioned about the multi priority for the ICANN community, but like as you say that we actually need to stay relevancy to the community. It seems that to the community the DNS abuse issue is something really hot in the right now, because everyone just really concerned about the security when they connect with the internet. Another thing is like actually the DNS abuse with also have a high relevancy with the whois data. Like as long as we can't see the actual like people, the owner of the domain name, it's really hard for us to chase about who actually doing the abuse. So I just want to hear about your comment on this, and how can we move faster for this too? Thank you.
Okay. Anybody want to answer the question? Eamon? Eamon, go first.
Sure. So I think DNS abuse, of course, is important. Again, it is a multi priority. The reason why I agree with Bruce is that the whois discussion has been going on for a long time. It was expedited because of the GDPR, but it is a fundamental issue that has been around for a very long time. So on DNS abuse, I think you touch on an interesting topic, because both actually from the from the technical security community and from the intellectual property rights community make the same argument that says, we need some of the data, even if the data is not 100%. We need the data to do pattern matching and to stop abuse. What is interesting, though, is in the discussion, it seems like there is more willingness to work with the technical community, and that's that's reason why it's tied into DNS abuse. But linking it all the way to the intellectual property rights part is probably the last thing we want to do, because I think that actually creates more problem than try to solve. So that's sort of my view on this particular item, and I think hopefully the intellectual property rights stuff could be dealt with in the RPM work and DNS abuse focused on the technical side, and I think would be more fruitful. And that's sort of my general thoughts.
Okay. Kenny, 1 minute for you, and then Bruce, prepare for after the Kenny, and then that's Jialong to finish this session. So Kenny first, go ahead.
Okay, right. Thank you. Basically, when the GDPR launched, and ICANN actually a lot of, because the original WHOIS service infringed a GDPR requirement. So initially, ICANN first response was WHOIS should be open to the public, because to prevent cybercrime, because the law enforcement agent can utilize that kind of data to prevent cybercrime happening. But we need to back to the original purpose of WHOIS. The original purpose of WHOIS is not for cybercrime. It's not designed for a law enforcement agent. And that's why the community proposed that ICANN should provide some mechanism to allow law enforcement agents to be able to confidentially access to the database to collect the information, the registration information they like. And that's a good proposal, but it takes time, it takes a lot of resources to make it. That's why I mentioned ICANN still has a position. ICANN can walk away back to the original WHOIS 1.0, and instead of give out a current proposal, because it's very complicated. Making the operator of the new mechanism will be too much burden for them. And so meanwhile, we do need to consider consider a balance, how to balance to reduce the potential cybercrime and also protect the human right for registration information as well. So anyway, it's still struggling right now. Thank you.
Okay, Bruce.
Yeah, I think my view is that if you can solve WHOIS and you provide an accountability mechanism, and you can actually contact the person that's behind a domain name, the intellectual property dispute should be dealt with between the intellectual property holder and the holder of the domain name. I think the only reason ICANN gets in the middle of that is when you can't actually see who owns the domain name, and therefore you can't take any action. So comes back to my earlier point. I think we need to have a solution to the accountability problem, which is that you're free to register a domain name, but you can be held accountable for what you use it for. If you're infringing someone's legal rights, then that's a dispute between you and the holder of those rights.
Okay, Jialong, you are the last one. 1 minute, so helping us to finish this session. Jialong.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add. This remains an issue that the community needs to find a way to get past, and we have many brilliant minds, and I'm hoping we can find a way to get past it. Then just as closing, thanks everyone for the opportunity. Really enjoyed myself at this session. Thank you.
Okay. I think we run over 2 minutes. So let me finish this workshop. First of all, I need to thank all the speakers. First of all, like Bruce, your lunch is late for 2 hours, right?
That's right.
And Jialong and Kenny and also the Eamon, it's a time for you to go to lunch. Thank you very much for you to join our workshop. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
And also thanks for this. Thanks also the TWIGF, the working group, is Li Xian, Irene, and they are helping us to make this the whole session running smoothly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.